All right, so in this video, I want to review the set of practice problems which are posted on Moodle. Remember, there's not going to be a video quiz over this video. This is meant strictly as a way to cover the answers for that practice problem as we would in a synchronous class, but doing so asynchronously so that we can save some of our synchronous class time to engage in some discussions about what is valuable in the macroeconomy and how we can work together to think about how the economy can work for everybody in the future. So the first question is, what is the effect on aggregate demand? And I want you to determine the effect on the short-run aggregate demand curve for each of the following scenarios, sketching a graph to illustrate each answer, and to accurately label all lines, points, and axes when drawing the graphs for these exercises. To help you answer these questions, it's really going to be beneficial for you to think of GDP or output as being determined by consumption plus investment plus government spending minus taxes plus exports minus imports. And when you do that, then we can think about whether the catalysts, whether the scenarios described are either going to increase or decrease any of those components of GDP. So if we have a decrease in consumer wealth due to a plunge in stock prices, remember that this isn't going to be due to a change in prices throughout the economy, but in the price of a particular interest-bearing asset, then we're going to have consumer wealth decrease, which is going to decrease consumption at all prices and lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which would decrease our real GDP, decrease our price levels, and increase unemployment. On the other hand, if households and businesses have more optimistic expectations regarding future economic performance, then that may lead them to spend more because they are going to need to keep fewer reserves on hand in preparation for a rainy day, because they don't feel as if a rainy day is on the horizon. And so this would lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which would increase our aggregate output and decrease unemployment, as well as increasing the price levels in the economy. Now, if there are higher levels of investment spending by businesses, then that's a pretty clear-cut case that I is going to increase. And if C plus I plus G minus T plus X minus M increases, then Y is going to increase as well. We're going to have an increase to our aggregate demand from 80 naught to 81, which would increase aggregate output and decrease unemployment, as well as increasing price levels in the economy. I apologize for that. That is my dog. Now, if the government cuts taxes for households and businesses, then G minus T, all else equal, will get larger as taxes get smaller. And so that means that output is going to increase as well. And so we have an increase in aggregate demand. So remember, it's a little bit different than the Keynesian cross model, where taxes factor in through the expenditure function, through the consumption function, and not through the government spending. In this case, we want to think about government spending and taxes as impacting shifts in aggregate demand. And so if this were the case, then we'd increase price levels in the economy, increase output, as measured by real GDP and decrease unemployment. We can conduct similar exercises for measuring the effect of market force changes on the short-run aggregate supply curve by also drawing new short-run aggregate supply curves on the following graphs, as well as labeling all the lines, points, and axes when drawing these graphs. So remember, when we're thinking about the short-run aggregate supply curve, we want to think about the cost of inputs of production and the productivity growth in the economy. So if there's labor productivity increasing in the macroeconomy, then that's going to be a case where the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to increase. So SRAS naught to SRAS1, which is going to increase our real output and decrease unemployment, while simultaneously lowering price levels in the economy, which is going to be different from an increase in aggregate demand, which would be inflationary when it's expansionary. On the other hand, if an earthquake were to destroy a significant amount of infrastructure in the economy, then we would be able to produce less. It would be more expensive to produce the same amount of aggregate output because our productive infrastructure would be depleted. And so we would have a decrease in our short-run aggregate supply, which would be contractionary, which would lead to a decrease in our level of output, as well as inflationary. So there is less value produced in the economy, and it is at a higher price. Technological progress will occur in the or will manifest in the opposite direction, that it would result in an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve from SRAS naught to SRAS1, which would increase real GDP and decrease unemployment, as well as decreasing price levels throughout the economy. And lastly, we want to think about a government policy which would increase the minimum wage for a significant number of workers. And this is an example where it's easy to overthink this problem and just like in the microeconomic model, jump one step ahead. In this case, we want to think about the minimum wage as representing the price of labor, which is a primary input into production in the economy. And if we increase the price of an input in this model, then we are going to decrease the short-run aggregate supply curve, which would decrease output, increase unemployment, and increase prices throughout the economy. It would be inflationary. And so this is an example about how neoclassical assumptions are embedded in this aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, and we can see some of that neoclassical thinking of increases in minimum wage as leading to increases in unemployment through this framework as well. And so it depends on what these workers are producing and whether if they are producing something that is going to increase our technological productivity, then it could increase our short-run aggregate supply. In addition to decreasing it, it could increase our aggregate demand by giving them more purchasing power. However, the direct effect of this policy, what you should focus on, is that it decreases the short-run aggregate supply curve. And as fracking has been in the news with vice presidential debates in the United States in the fall of 2020, we know that fracking is thought of as a transitional energy resource from relying on oil and coal to meet our energy needs in the United States into a world where we have greener technologies such as solar and wind power. Remember, fracking here is going to it's going to be short for hydraulic fracturing, which is a way of extracting natural gas from the earth. And if we have an increase in fracking, which causes the price of oil and natural gas to fall, then as fossil fuels are still a primary input into production in the US, and that's going to cause a fall in the price of a primary input, which is going to increase our short-run aggregate supply curve, which is going to be beneficial for the real GDP in the economy, which is going to permeate throughout the rest of the economy and create more jobs, have less unemployment, all while bringing prices down and making goods and services more affordable in the country. So I also want to think not only about shifts of entire curves, but still about movements, and to think about a change in the market price for the entire economy, leading to a change in either the quantity of aggregate demand or the quantity of aggregate supply. And so that quantity is being measured by real GDP. And in this case, we want to think about the market price for the macroeconomy as being the relative price level, which captures economy-wide inflation or deflation in prices of private goods, labor, and of money, such as interest rates. And in these problems, I want you to indicate the change in the quantity demand or quantity supply as a result of the price changes, which we're going to discuss. So if we have a rise in the consumer price index, which is measuring inflation for goods and services which impact household budgets and standards of living, and that is going to lead producers to, implying that that is the cause here, increase their output, then we know that we're going to have a movement along one of these curves, and that it's going to measure a rise in prices and an increase in output. And so we know then that it's an increase in the short run, increase in the quantity of aggregate supply. And so the quantity of short run aggregate supply is going to increase. On the other hand, if we have an increase in the real value of money in the economy due to lower aggregate price level, so once again, focus on due to a lower aggregate price level, that leads to more household purchases, then we know once again that we have a movement because lower aggregate price levels are the catalyst. We know that we're going to move in one of these directions, that prices are decreasing and there's more household purchases. Then we have this. We have an increase in the quantity of aggregate demand in the economy. Now, just to answer the last two questions about the long-run aggregate supply curve, we know that the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical because it doesn't depend on price levels in the economy. So that we have price, we have output, we have the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is equal to potential GDP, which is our full employment GDP. That is only depends on what we are capable of producing, not on producers' decisions. And it's going to be independent of price. So it doesn't matter if price increases from 80 to 120, unless there's a change to our productive capacity in the economy, we are going to produce the same level of real GDP as measured by our potential GDP. On the other hand, just because the long-run aggregate supply curve doesn't change in response to price levels, doesn't mean that it can't decrease if our productive capacity is depleted and we have a technological setback, or that it could increase if we develop a new technology such as graphene, which would be a material which would increase conductivity, allow us to more efficiently deplete salt from salt water to lead to desalination, and create more water in areas where it's previously scarce, and just other sorts of productive capacity increases as well, which would increase the sustainable level of economic activity over the long run. So hopefully these more or less seem intuitive at this point. Really the only example that's not covered in these are how one particular market force could lead to two sorts of changes. However, we considered that also in the previous video as well. So in response to, or I guess in anticipation of not wanting to load you up with new material before the test, not wanting to provide too much content for you to watch and keep in the back of your mind for the next test, we're going to cut off the videos for the week at this point and just provide more content in the weeks following the next exam, leading up to the third and final exam. So that's it for this week. If you have any questions over any of these videos, please feel free to contact me. However, remember that the very first video on comparative advantage and this video on the practice problems are not going to be covered on the video quizzes for this week. Otherwise, thanks for your attention, and we'll see you in class.